So for the first problem for cylindrical coordinates, what we have here is the searchlight shown in the figure casts a spot of light along the face of a wall that is located 100 meters from the searchlight. So what you need to determine are the magnitudes of the velocity and also the acceleration at which the spot appears to travel across the wall at the instant where the angle theta is equal to 45 degrees. And also, it is given that the searchlight rotates at a constant rate of 4 radians per second. So, the 4 radians per second, this is the angular velocity, the theta dot of our searchlight. So, the magnitude of our velocity is 800 meters per second, and the magnitude of acceleration is 6,400 meters per second squared. So let us solve the first sample problem. So just a solution the for this problem, when we solve for the when we encounter problems for cylindrical coordinates, it's better that you familiarize the equations na gamiton for the cylindrical components, for especially for the velocity and the acceleration. So, but before that, um, what we do what we do first is we establish the coordinate system. So the coordinate system for this problem is typically the polar coordinates. So kung two-dimensional, if it is a two-dimensional, that is a polar coordinates, and the polar coordinates consist of the r and the theta. R is the radial and theta is the transverse. So kung 3D is what we call cylindrical coordinates, which we will discuss that later on. So the figure can be considered as our coordinate system. And we will draw also later a top view for this one so that we can analyze further the problem. So afterwards, for the first part, which is the magnitude of velocity. So when we determine the magnitude of velocity, from the definition of the velocity itself, the component form or the vector form of velocity is equal to the radial to its radial component, so that is VR times the unit vector UR, plus its transverse component, or the V theta times the unit vector U theta. So the first part represents the radial component, and the second part represents the transverse component, where VR, or the radial, is the first derivative of r with respect to the time, or r dot, and V theta, that is the r times the theta dot, or r times the angular velocity. So Pag-determine sa magnitude, ang magnitude nato is using the um, Pythagorean theorem, that is the square root of VR squared plus V theta squared. So ang atong kailangan lang is pag-establish sa equation sa R. We don't know what is the equation of our R. Okay? So we need to determine the R, the equation of R, or the radial equation, so that we can determine the value for our VR and V theta, so that mao na itong gamiton na determine sa magnitude of our velocity. Okay, ang theta dot or the angular velocity is already given in our problem, which is 4 radians per second. So for us to determine the R, we need to draw a top view for this one. So if I just redraw the figure, if this is our wall, take note this is a top view. What I draw here, this is the top view, and naa diri si searchlight. So kaning si searchlight, pwede mag-rotate or nag-rotate ni siya, and the light is crossing the wall. So ang distance niya from the wall is 100 meters based from the figure. So that is 100 meters. And ang searchlight na iyahang gi-emit, or ang light rather na iyang gi-emit, is represented with the distance r, which is it is based from the angle of 45 degrees, or it is based from the transverse angle, which is the angle theta. And ang iyahang angular velocity or iyang rotation or ang iyang theta dot has a constant rate of 4 radians per second. So mao na yung top view. So before we proceed on the finding the equation for R, for us, ang iyang velocity manggod ani, if I draw the R and the radial and transverse axis, the R and theta axis, since we are using polar coordinates for the coordinate system. So ang iyang R is align sa kaning R nato na distance. So that is aligned with our R. So that is our R axis or the radial axis. And the perpendicular, that is our transverse axis or the theta axis. So this one, this describes the radial component of your velocity, and this other part is the transverse component of our velocity. So the velocity of our searchlight is found along the wall. So mao na to ang velocity mismo sa atong searchlight. And This is only a representation of the like the other um, coordinate system for finding the magnitude of the velocity. So this part, mana tong gamiton for us to determine or to identify the equation sa to ang R. Kay R man na to ang gamit, ang atong pangitaon para ma-determine nato si VR o V theta or the radial and the transverse component of the velocity. So based on the figure shown here na gidraw na ko based on the top view, what kind of figure can you see here? Unsay klaseng figure ang inyong makita dire? Triangle. What kind of triangle is that, Jugar? Unsay klaseng triangle? That is the right triangle. So, from the figure itself, since it forms a right triangle, kanda, right triangle man na to ang na-form based sa if we draw the top view. So, mo na itong R, theta, o 100. Mo na itong gamiton para i-determine ang equation sa R, especially it will be an equation as a function of angle theta or it will be a function of theta. So, based sa ato ang gidraw na right triangle and also the given variables and the value na 100, what trigonometric function ato ang ma-apply dire? Kung sa itong pwede magamit na trigonometric function. Cosine. Thank you, Mantalaba. That is cosine theta or cosine angle adjacent over the hypotenuse. So that would be cosine theta R, adjacent rather is the 100 and the hypotenuse is R. So atong R would be 100 over the cosine theta. So mo ni ang equation sa R with respect to theta or as a function of theta rather, nagamito nato para pag first derivative and also we substitute here sa to ang radial and transverse components sa to ang velocity. So this is the equation. R is equal to 100 over cosine theta. So just a continuation, so since R is equal to 100 cosine theta, we also write that one as 100 secant theta. Okay, di ba, ang 1 over cosine theta is secant. If you still remember of the other trigonometric functions. Usually when I memorize other trigo functions, 1 over sine is cosecant, and 1 over the cosine angle is secant theta. So kung S, opposite would be C, and C, the opposite is S. So it's just like you just only remember the first letter. So anyway, why I wrote this in this form para mas dali na ko siya pag-differentiate or pag-derive. So we can now differentiate or pag-derive sa tong equation. And take note, I did not substitute directly the 45 degrees. Okay, so ang Juan Manggod ani, this is the equation sa R at any angle. Okay? So, pwede na ito magamit if we want to determine for other angle like 60, 80, 70, and etc. So, later pala to i-substitute si 45 degrees once ma differentiate na to or mag-derivative na ta. So, we can now perform derivative or mag-differentiate on this equation. So, kung mag-derivative, that is actually the derivative of r with respect to time. So, that is 100 second theta over or with respect to time rather. So, every time mag-derivative tawag mga equations, here, sa ato ang cylindrical components, it is differentiating it with respect to time. And ang derivative sa second, di ba ang derivative sa second is equal to second theta tangent theta d theta. So, if you still remember your conventional calculus, this is the derivative of second. So, that is the second times tangent, tas dapat d theta, kay ang derivative sa second, second theta tangent theta. Ang derivative, and we also include the theta, so mao na napatay d theta pa na sa last part. So this would be dr d theta is equal to 100, since 100 is a constant, then second theta tangent theta times d theta over dt, and the dr over dt, that is the r dot. So if we simplify our equation, the dr over dt, that is the r dot, and the d theta over dt is the theta dot, or what we call the angular velocity. Okay, so mao niya to ang first derivative sa r nato. So actually okay raman na dili na ninyo the same ani na dr over dt. Pwede na r dot na diretsyo, because ang r dot manggod, kung na dot sa taas, it means that is the derivative of an equation with respect to time. So the same thing with sa theta dot, that is d theta over dt. So kung every time mag-derivative mo o trigonometric function, that is the derivative sa function, the trigonometric function, say the second theta, so that is second theta tangent theta, times the derivative sa angle theta mismo. So, ang derivative sa angle theta is d theta over dt, or theta dot. So, it is by applying the chain rule when we perform this one. So, just an example sa chain rule, if you still remember sa chain rule, di ba kung mag-chain rule ta, especially with power rule, the derivative sa y Sometimes we wrote that as y prime. It means that is dy over dx. So that is 2x plus 1, x plus 1 raised to the power of 1. Then ang derivative sa sulod, so that would be 1 mismo. So mura siya og kanang um, isa-isa ninyo derivative. So unsay derivative sa x plus 1 squared, so mao nang 2 times x plus 1. Og derivative sa sulod, mao na ang 1 na derivative. So dire, ang derivative sa second theta, mao nang second theta tangent theta, and derivative sa sulod, which is the theta, so mao na ang d theta over dt. But anyway, mao na itong r dot and r. So we can use that to determine the values of our r and r dot. So ang gamiton nato na values is based on the angle na 45 degrees. So from the angle na 45 degrees, mao na at that instant kung asa i-emit ang light from the searchlight. So unsa ang iyahang magnitude sa velocity and magnitude sa iyang acceleration at the angle of 45 degrees. And also, ang angular velocity nato is equal to 4 radians per second. So that is the theta dot. So we just substitute here on our equation. If we let the angle theta is equal to 45, ayun lang let, at na lang, at theta is equal to 45 degrees because at that instant man, and the angular velocity or theta dot, that is 4 radians per second. So we just only substitute here sa tong r and r dot. So sa r nato, that is 100 second. So second 45 degrees. So you just only, if wala man tayo second sa calculator, you can use 100 over cosine 45 degrees. So pila tong r anak? Please help me identify what's the value of r. And r dot nato, that is 100. I'll just rewrite it again. R dot is 100 second 45 degrees tangent 45 degrees, and the theta dot is 4 radians per second. So pila man natong r? How much is what's the value of r nato? So since wala may second sa calculator, over cosine ta na. So that would be 100 over cosine 45 degrees. So ang r nato is, pila man natong r? Anyone who can tell me pila tong r? 141 0.42 meters. Take note, meter ang atong gigamit diri sa unit because natay 100 meters here, so that is a meter. And for the R dot, that would be uh, pila man to ang kuan R dot. So 100, 1 over cosine 45 degrees, kay wala may second sa calculator, times tangent 45 degrees times 4. What's the value of our R dot? 565.69. So, ang unit na to sa R dot is meters per second. Nga naman meters per second because pag derivative man gud nato sa R, that is with respect to time. So, since meter man na tong R, so pag derivative with respect to time, so may mo siya meters per second. So, technically, this is a velocity, kaning R dot. Mao na ito ang radial component sa velocity is equal to R dot kay meters per second manggod ni. So, we had already the values of R and R dot. So, just a continuation. So, the VR nato is equal to R dot. So, that is 565.69 meters per second. That is the radial component of your velocity. And V theta that is R times theta dot, or R times the angular velocity. So that is 141.42 times 4 radians per second. So that would be 565.68 gyapon. Just 0.01 increment with the VR. So that is 565.68 meters per second. So meters per second gihapon. Okay, ang sa 4 radians per second man. So when you multiply it with the radians, you did not include the radians naman god. So that's why meters per second na siya. So meter naman yung 141.42, tapos 4 radians per second, so that is 4 per second lang ang ato i-consider. So mao na meters per second ng iyahang unit. So we have already the two components. So the magnitude of our velocity is equal to the square root of VR squared plus V theta squared. So that is 565.69 squared plus 565.68 squared. O, pila man na to ang magnitude, everyone? What's the value of our magnitude? Five, 566? 799. So 799 or 800, approximately 800, ano lang, 799.99 meters per second, or approximately 800 meters per second. So that is the magnitude of our velocity. So nakuha lang nato ang magnitude sa velocity. Wala na tayong problema. Okay, so typically you just only familiarize the equation of the um, radial and transverse components sa velocity nimo. Then ang magnitude is using the Pythagorean theorem. Okay? So let us proceed on the for the magnitude of acceleration. So just a continuation. So for the magnitude of acceleration, its component form or vector form sa acceleration, which it has the both radial and transverse component, the same with the velocity. So that is AR times the unit vector UR. So that is its radial component plus U theta times the unit vector, A theta times the unit vector U theta. So that is describing the transverse component, where these two, kanya congruent circle, these are the radial and transverse components of your acceleration. So ang AR nimo is equal to R double dot minus R theta dot squared, and A theta is equal to R theta dot plus 2R dot times theta dot. So this can be found on the lecture notes in this topic. So these are the equivalent kanimo ng equation for the radial and transverse components sa acceleration. So based sa kaning equation nato, ang atong needed are the R double dot and theta double dot. Kay ang other derivatives or time derivatives na gitawag nato kay nakuha na nato kanina sa velocity. Okay? So let us focus here sa R double dot. So ang first niya was 100 second theta, di ba? And ang iyang first derivative was 100 second theta tangent theta theta dot. So we just determine unsang iyang second derivative na pod. So mao ni iyang R double dot. Mao ni iyang second derivative. Kung second derivative na, especially kung align or naka meters ang iyahang unit with respect, tapos i-derivative nato with respect to time, from velocity mahimo na siya acceleration. So ang unit nato for R double dot would be in meters per second squared. So here, if you notice, we have actually three different variables or different entities. So we have second theta, tangent theta, and theta double dot. So dili pa nato i-substitute like what I mentioned, di sa nato i-substitute si 45 degrees og 4. Pero, uh, kani, this is multiplication man, and these three are different entities. So, if you imagine na how can you differentiate kung tulo ka variables ang inyong i-derivative. Buragod og, for example, y is equal to x, y, z. Tulo sila. Kung saan man inyong pag-derivative, ana, actually, there is a way for you to derive or pag-differentiate ani. You can still apply what do you call this? Product rule. So, pag dili siya y, w na lang. So, we can still differentiate this one even though natay tulo ka buok na different variables. So, pag differentiate ani, we can still apply product rule. So, this is what we call triple product rule. Or you can apply this if ever three or more variables ang imong may counter na multiply. So pwede pa na pay other variables na or other variable na gi-multiply pa dire. So pag differentiate or pag derivative, so isa-isaw lang nimo derivative sa each of your variable. So that would be x prime wz. So ang una nako is x. And then multiply lang nimo tong wz. And then again, you just only differentiate the first one, the first variable. So x is mao niya to ang first variable. So x prime na siya or derivative sa x, x prime. Tapos copy lang nimo ang other two variables, w and z, plus x w prime z. So ang ikaduha na po di mo i-derivative plus x w z prime. So ang last na po the variable ang inyong differentiate or i-derivative. So this is what we call a triple product rule. Pero like what I mentioned, pwede ninyo magamit ni if it is two or three or more variables na. Actually, the same nagyapon siya sa UDV plus VDU gihapon. Di ba ang sa say XZ X Z prime plus ZX prime. So murag gisaysa ra nimo derivative ang kada variable sa every pagkuan. Then you just only multiply it to the other variable na wala derivative. So in our case, kana tong pwede gamiton, pero based sa to ang problem, si theta dot nato or the angular velocity is actually a constant. Mao man lang sa to ang statement diri sa last part. The searchlight rotates at the constant rate of 4 radians per second. So since constant man siya, meaning every time any angle pa na siya like 50, 60, 70, 80, 100, or etc., ang iyang angular velocity at any angle will have the same value of 4 radians per second. So, it means that pwede na to i-substitute directly si 4. Compare sa 45 degrees diri sa angle theta, di sa nato i-substitute. Kay, dili man gud siya ang atong angle theta na 45 degrees is not a constant. That is a kanang at an instant lang mismo. So at a portion lang mismo. So that's why ang atong theta dot na 4 radians per second or the angular velocity is a substitute that to directly. Kay, like what I mentioned, every angle will have the same angular velocity. So kung 50 degrees, 4 radians per second gyapon na siya. Kung 60 degrees, 4 radians per second gyapon na siya, and so on and so forth. So we can substitute directly the 4 para ang mahitabo, duwa na lang ka variables or two different entities na lang atong i-focus. Kaning si second theta o tangent theta. So this would be r dot is equal to 400 second theta tangent theta. So mo na itong i-differentiate, okay, i-derivative with respect to time. So just a continuation. So that was 400 second theta tangent theta. So ang second derivative, r double dot. So ang r double dot na to, that is a derivative of r dot with respect to time. So wala na ko siya gisulat og ingani. Diretso na nako kay meaning ana second derivative, then with respect to time gihapon. So we can use product rule since these two are different terms or entities. So using product rule, if we have u is equal to second theta, some derivative sa u would be, just to rewrite it again. If u is equal to second theta, so the derivative of u is like what I've mentioned kanina, that was second theta tangent theta, and since it is with respect to time, times the theta dot. So don't forget the derivative sa imong angle, theta. So mo nang theta dot na to. Then ang v is tangent theta. Some derivatives sa tangent, if you still remember your calculus, that is second squared theta. Diba? You have like a table for that to familiarize the derivatives of different trigonometric functions. So the derivative of tangent is second squared theta. Then ang derivative sa theta is theta dot mismo. So that is second squared theta times theta dot. So mo nang imohang gamiton to perform product rule. So that would be UdV plus VdU. So U nato is second theta and dV is second squared theta dot. So mo nimong U ang second and dV plus V nato is tangent theta, and du, derivative sa u, is secant theta tangent theta times theta dot. So you just only simplify that, then i-distribute mo 400. So this would be 400. This will become secant cube theta dot plus secant theta tangent squared theta times theta dot. So, i-combine lang nako ang secant o secant squared theta. So, mo ng secant cube theta. Then, ang tangent theta times tangent theta, may mo na siya tangent squared theta. So, you just substitute the values of the angle theta and also the angular velocity na 4. So, this is the second derivative of your r. At yung 100 times secant theta, this is its second derivative. Actually, for time derivatives, ang kutob lang niya is second derivative lang. Wala na siya third, fourth, fifth, or etc. So kung time derivatives or that notation na gitawag nato na na-dot sa taas, kutob lang siya second derivative. So at theta is equal to 45 degrees, or at the instant ng angle is 45 degrees, and ang constant angular velocity is 4 radians per second. So we substitute that on our equation. That would be 400 secant cube. Sometimes when we write that kung na ay exponent, so secant 45 degrees cube, meaning after niyo pag-determine sa iyahang secant sa 45 degrees, i-cube na po nimo times the angular velocity na 4 plus secant 45 degrees times tangent 45 degrees squared times 4. O pila man na to ang value sa r double dot na to. Pila man itong value sa r double dot. So, 400, 1 over cosine. Okay, wala man tayo second sa calculator times 4 plus 1 over cosine 45 degrees na pod times tangent 45 squared times 4. O pila man na to ang r double dot. What's the value of our r double dot? Is it 6,700? Ay, okay. Sorry. Mao niya akong gingon na may mistake lang. Di ba gi-multiply nato siya sa 400? I-multiply nato sa 400. So, wala na to gi-include og multiply og 400 dire sa second term. So, mao na most probably basin mao na every time mag-solve mo, you always, when you compute, you always check your solution. Kay basin wala ninyo gi-appeal o multiply ang other term. Kaya sa second part, wala na to gi-appeal o multiply ang 400. So, mo na second theta tangent squared theta dot. So, I think most mistakes of students, they forgot to multiply. Diba, pag multiply dili sa first term, nakalimutan dili sa second term. So they forgot to multiply the second term, like what we did here. So ayaw mo kalimot jud sa pag-multiply each term na gi-separate with a plus or minus sign. So rewrite nato, this would be 400 secant 45 degrees times tangent 45 degrees squared times 4. So again, pila pa tong value, ana? Sometimes, if ever wala pa ninyo gi-raise ang kuan, i-rewrite lang nimo ang kuan sa calculator. So 6788.23. So gapin na ninyo ang 400. Tama ba? Gapin ninyo ang 400 sa second term. Okay. So you actually found out that, no. That's good. So that is 6,788.23. And the unit is meters per second squared. Okay, so like what I've mentioned, since this is a second derivative, what do you call this? The unit nato is an acceleration, so mo na naka meters per second squared. So we have already the value of r double dot. Ang sa theta double dot, continuation lang nato, ang angle theta nato is 400. Pero ang theta dot nato is 4 radians per second. Especially this is a constant. Okay? And pag-determine sa derivative of your angular velocity with respect to time, which is the theta double dot. Theta double dot means that is the angular acceleration. So kung isa ka dot, that is the angular velocity. And theta double dot, that is your angular acceleration. So, if you notice, based sa problem, ang angular velocity nato is a constant of 4 radians per second. So, pag derivative nimo, ana, since it is a constant, derivative of a constant would be equal to 0. So, that would be equal to 0 radians per second squared. So, mao na, kana, constant man siya. So, pag derivative nimo sa theta dot, pag determine sa theta double dot or the angular acceleration, so the value would be a 0. Kay ang derivative man of a constant is a 0. So we can now determine the radial and transverse component. So ang radial nato is AR nato, or the radial component sa acceleration is r double dot minus r theta dot squared. And the transverse component is r theta dot, r theta double dot rather, plus 2r dot theta dot. Actually, I don't know how you pronounce this with the dot. Actually, I just name it as r double dot, r dot, theta dot, and theta double dot. But there are actually some names for this one, especially sa theta, angular velocity, and angular acceleration. But anyway, we will just substitute the values. So this is um, 6,788.22 minus ang R nato was, if we go back sa itong solution sa velocity, na-solve naman nato kanina. So that was 141.42 and then 565 manatong na-solve dire. So 141.42 and 565.69. So minus 141.42 times 4 squared. So pila tong value ana. And then for the second, that is 141.42 times 0 plus 2 times 565.69, if I'm not mistaken, times 4. And what would be our value for the transverse component? Pila man na to ang AR? What's the value of our AR na to? 4525. 0.51 meters per second squared. Take note, meters per second squared, because that is a acceleration. How about the A theta? Pila? So 0 naman ni So you just only focus to 2 times 565.69 times 4. So pila man natong value in this part? So 4,525.52 meters per second squared. So we do have, we got already the radial and transverse component of your acceleration. So ang magnitude nato sa acceleration is equal to AR squared plus A theta squared. So that would be A is equal to the square root of 4525.51 squared, then 4525.52 squared. So pila man ang magnitude sa itong acceleration once we substitute to our this equation sa Pythagorean theorem. $6,400. So that is 6,400 meters per second squared. So this is The magnitude of our acceleration, 6,000 meters per second squared. So, atong velocity, base sa to ang i-compute, the magnitude of our velocity was 800 meters per second, and acceleration is 6,400 meters per second squared. So if we check to our uh, first slide, 800 and 6,400. So that is the value of the magnitude of velocity and acceleration. So for curvilinear cylindrical components rather, you just only what we call this, you just only familiarize the what we call this, the equation sa radial and transverse components sa imuhang velocity and acceleration. Okay? So, do you have any questions so far on the first example question?